What if your life completely crumbled? Could faith rebuild it all? There was a woman in the Bible who lost her husband, her sons, and her very reason to live. She returned to her homeland with empty hands and a heart heavy with bitterness. They called her Naomi, but she named herself Mara, meaning bitter. Yet in that darkness, God began to weave a new destiny. Naomi's story isn't just about loss. It's about grace, second chance, and a faith that refuses to collapse, even when everything is gone. This isn't just an ancient tale. It's a vibrant reminder for us today. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to uncover untold stories where outsiders become God's chosen. In a time when the promised land turned barren, when bread vanished from tables and laughter faded from Bethlehem's markets, a small family made a heart-wrenching choice to leave their home. Amid famine, despair, and uncertainty, Naomi, a wife, a mother, along with her husband Elimelech and their 2 sons, abandoned the place they once called home. They weren't fleeing God, no, they were escaping hunger, a ravenous hunger that could devour both faith and hope, leaving behind a void in body and soul. They arrived in Moab, a land of foreigners. It wasn't the promised land with no covenant for God's people. In Moab, strange idols were worshipped, and wary eyes followed Israelites with a mix of distance and disdain. Naomi knew this. She knew she was stepping into a place where faith faced trials, not from swords, but from difference and isolation. Yet Moab was the only place that opened its doors when Bethlehem shut theirs. There, Naomi tried to rebuild something resembling a life. Her sons grew up in this alien land and married. Ruth and Orpah, 2 Moabite women, kind, sincere, and devoted to their family. Perhaps in rare, peaceful evenings, as laughter echoed in their modest home, Naomi wondered, could this be a new beginning? A life not as she dreamed, but enough to call steady. But she could never have imagined that the place she thought was safe would become the grave of all she held dear. One day, Elimelech, her partner through life, died suddenly. Naomi, now a widow, stood frozen in a foreign land, burying her husband beneath an unfamiliar sky. Her heart cracked, but she still had her sons, a fragile thread of hope. Then, not long after, death knocked again. Both Mahlon and Chilion, her beloved sons, slipped away. Naomi, once a mother brimming with hope, was left a solitary woman, engulfed in grief too deep for words. She had nothing left, no land to till, no husband, no sons, no legacy. In ancient society, a woman without sons was a fragile figure, nearly erased from the edges of life. Naomi was now not just a stranger in a strange land, but a failure in the eyes of others, and perhaps in her own. A Jewish woman who sought life found only the tombs of her loved ones. Naomi had no name to claim but her pain. Yet where the world saw a broken woman, God saw a story unfinished. He was still writing line by line, step by step. And Naomi, though unaware, was in the heart of a journey of grace. Amid her shattered heart, a faint light flickered. Word reached Naomi. God had shown mercy to his people, bringing bread back to Bethlehem. To most, it was trivial news. But to Naomi, it was a whisper of life. And she rose, not just physically, she rose from the depths of ruin, from the shadows of despair. She resolved to return, not to reclaim what was lost, but to step toward an unknown future, carried by a tiny spark of faith that survived the storm. Naomi turned to her daughters-in-law, Go back to your mother's homes. May the Lord bless you as you have blessed the dead and me. A farewell steeped in love. Orpah, after many tears, embraced Naomi one last time and returned to her people. But Ruth would not. She clung to Naomi not just with family ties, but with a resolute faith. She, a foreigner, chose to forsake her homeland, her people, and her gods to follow a grieving mother-in-law. In that choice, Ruth didn't know she was sowing seeds for an eternal harvest. And so 2 women, one young, one old, one with a broken heart, the other with steadfast loyalty, left Moab together, heading for Bethlehem as the sun dipped low. No one awaited them. They carried no wealth, no status, only a heavy past and a murky future. But what Naomi didn't know was that in those trembling steps, God was preparing a new beginning. Bethlehem, the place that once starved her, would become the stage for grace and restoration beyond imagining. A story that seemed over was merely the first chapter of a lineage leading to the Messiah. Naomi didn't know, Ruth didn't know, but God knew, and He was quietly crafting a piece of redemption's history, from 2 women deemed outcasts, from profound loss, and from what the world called a dead end. Morning mist cloaked the rugged stone paths leading into Bethlehem. The city lay hushed in the dawn's quiet when 2 women's silhouettes emerged from the distance. One frail and stooped by age and life's burdens. The other, younger with resolute steps and eyes burning with determination. This was Naomi, and beside her, Ruth, her daughter-in-law, not bound by blood, but by an unbreakable vow that tied their fates together. They had crossed deserts for days, endured countless silent nights filled only with the sighs of memory. Naomi had nothing left but her past. She returned with empty hands and a heart full of cracks. Her name, Naomi, once meant pleasant, but she found no sweetness in herself anymore. As villagers recognized her, calling her name with stunned and pitying glances, she offered no smile in return. "Don't call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has made my life bitter." She wasn't angry at the villagers, nor at Ruth, who had forsaken her homeland and gods to follow her. She was angry at God, a raw, aching anger, not from a lack of faith, but from having believed so deeply. Naomi wasn't faithless. She had been a woman of strong faith. But what happens when that faith doesn't stop death? When God answers not with miracles, but with the cold silence of 3 graves. In the faint light of dawn, Naomi became a living emblem of buried bitterness. She once had everything: family, future, honor. Now she returned not to reclaim what was lost, but to live out her remaining years as a shadow. Yet God never writes endings as early as we do. And then there was Ruth. This young woman had no obligation to walk with Naomi, but she saw something deeper. Perhaps a quiet call from God, or maybe the stirring of a heart moved by a broken woman's resolve to rise and return. When Naomi urged her to stay in Moab, Ruth spoke words that would echo through history. "Where you go, I will go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God." No covenant could be stronger amid conflict, grief, and loss. Ruth didn't just choose Naomi. She chose faith, chose God, chose a path with no clear destination. In an era when women were seen as frail and dependent, Ruth became the strongest, not through power, but through love and loyalty. Naomi, in her bitterness, couldn't see it yet. She still believed God had forsaken her. But Ruth's devotion was the first sign that grace lingered, small and silent but never gone. Ruth was proof that even when we feel abandoned by God, He can send someone, a faint light in the darkest night. The villagers looked at Naomi with pity and curiosity. They didn't know that the quiet woman beside her, a Moabite with no place in Israel's lineage, would become a link to the Messiah. From unassuming loyalty, from a small but courageous choice, a plan of redemption was being woven, each stitch threading through the fate of humanity. Naomi couldn't see it yet. To her, life was still one bitter blow after another. But the moment she chose to return home, even carrying a heart full of disappointment, she unwittingly stepped into a pivotal moment in history. For God hadn't forgotten Naomi, and He doesn't forget those who are broken. Perhaps you've been like Naomi, returning to a familiar place with a heart no longer whole. Maybe you've renamed yourself in your soul from hope to bitterness. But if Ruth is any evidence, trust this: grace has never left you. It may come through a friend, a small act, a bold decision. And from there, God will write the rest of your story. An untold story, but one He already knows the end of. Dawn spilled over the barley fields like a whisper from God in the silence of heaven and earth. The early breeze danced through golden stalks, as if the fields themselves murmured a promise from above. Amid this tranquil scene, Ruth, the Moabite woman, bent low, gathering stray grains left behind by the reaper's steps. She didn't know that here, in this very place, a story of redemption was being woven, thread by thread, with Naomi, her mother-in-law, quietly holding the needle that guided their destiny. Naomi had lost everything, but what she hadn't lost was the wisdom forged through suffering. No longer defined by loss, she found, in the quiet of long nights and Ruth's steadfast gaze, a spark of faith once thought extinguished, beginning to flicker again. It wasn't a loud faith, but a steady, silent one. The faith of someone who'd tasted enough bitterness to know that God's silence doesn't mean His absence. Then a name stirred in Naomi's mind: Boaz, a kinsman of her late husband, Elimelech. Boaz was a man of renown, not just for wealth, but for kindness and righteousness. He noticed Ruth from the moment he saw her gleaning in his fields, ordering his workers not to harass her and setting aside extra grain for her. Naomi saw it. More than that, she discerned God's intent in the smallest of actions. In that moment, Naomi devised a plan, bold yet wrapped in wisdom, humility, and trust that God was still at work. She couldn't approach Boaz herself, but Ruth could. Ruth, whom Boaz had already noticed. In ancient Israel's culture, there was a law of kinsman redeemer, where a close relative of a deceased man could marry his widow to preserve the family line, property, and honor. Naomi didn't force Ruth, she guided her. One night, under the flicker of an oil lamp, she said, "Bathe, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, and go to the threshing floor. But don't let Boaz see you until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down to rest, note where he is, then go, uncover his feet, and lie there. He'll tell you what to do." This wasn't reckless audacity, as some might think. In the context of that culture and law, it was a courageous, profound act. Ruth was placing herself in a position to be redeemed with dignity and purpose. And Naomi, once Mara, was becoming Naomi again. a wise, guiding mother. She was no longer drowning in despair. She was stepping boldly into God's plan with small, trembling steps. That night, Ruth followed Naomi's words precisely. Boaz awoke in the dark, startled to find a woman at his feet. When he learned it was Ruth, he didn't grow angry or suspicious. He understood. Ruth wasn't seeking cheap affection. She was proposing something holy, a chance to keep Elimelech's line alive in Israel. Boaz was moved. Ruth hadn't chased younger men. She chose what was right, what was greater. He promised to act rightly come morning, though another kinsman had first rights to redeem under the law. Ruth returned home before dawn, carrying 6 measures of barley Boaz had given her, a quiet sign of care and hope. When Ruth stepped into the house, Naomi understood with a single glance. Her eyes lit up, not for the barley, but because the plan was in motion. It was the look of a mother who'd endured enough loss to know that miracles sometimes come not from angels, but from quiet, righteous acts. Naomi no longer sat in darkness. She rose not with physical strength, but with a soul restored by faith. She didn't wait for God to do everything. She stepped into his plan, trusting he was with her, even when his hand was unseen. From that night, Naomi was no longer the bitter, aging woman living on memories. She was a vibrant part of redemption's current. Her faith-filled wisdom opening a door for Ruth, for Boaz, and for a future she couldn't yet fathom. But God knew, and he always begins great things from hearts that seem shattered. Morning sunlight softly bathed the gate of Bethlehem, where ancient stones had witnessed countless stories of God's chosen people. Today, this place became the stage for a decisive moment. Not loud, not bloody, but where destiny was sealed with words, honor, and the sacred law of God. Naomi stood at a distance, her weathered hands clutching an old shawl. She didn't need to be among the elders, among the men debating rights and duties, but her eyes followed every gesture, every nod, every glance, as if her soul were being woven into the threads of fate unraveling at the city gate. Ruth stayed home, as Naomi instructed. This wasn't just one widow's story, it was a divine reckoning of justice and courage. Boaz appeared, his long cloak flowing, his face solemn yet lit with a spark in his eyes. He was ready. Before him sat 10 elders of the city, guardians of the law and living witnesses to any covenant made. But another man was summoned, the closer kinsman, who held the first right to redeem Elimelech's land, Naomi's late husband, and with it, Ruth, the Moabite widow. The air grew taut. Onlookers didn't grasp the moment's weight. But in that strangely hushed space, a door of destiny was opening. And it was only for the brave to step through. Boaz rose, his voice clear and steady. He recounted the situation. Naomi had returned from Moab without husband or sons. By law, the nearest kinsman could redeem Elimelech's land, and if he chose to, he would also take Ruth to preserve the name of the deceased in Israel's lineage. All eyes turned to the man called the closer kinsman. He paused, then nodded. "I will redeem," he said. A flicker of worry crossed Boaz's face, and from afar, Naomi seemed to hold her breath. But Boaz pressed on. "If you redeem the land, you must also marry Ruth, the Moabite, widow of the deceased, to maintain his name on his inheritance." These words, though gentle, carried the weight of a sword's edge. For now, this wasn't just about rights, it was about duty, about honor, about choosing between self-interest and justice. The kinsman slowly shook his head. "I cannot redeem it, lest I harm my own inheritance. Let the right pass to you." Following custom, he removed his sandal and handed it to Boaz, sealing the transfer of redemption before all. In that moment, Naomi, from a distance, gently closed her eyes, not to escape but to breathe a prayer. Relief surged within her, not because all was settled, but because she saw God's hand quietly at work, even in the public square, even in rituals that seemed routine. Boaz turned to the elders, his voice ringing with authority and conviction. "Today, you are witnesses that I have redeemed all that belonged to Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, and I take Ruth, Mahlon's widow, as my wife. So the name of the dead will not be cut off from his lineage." The crowd stirred, but none objected. Instead, the elders blessed him. "May the Lord make this woman like Rachel and Leah, who built the house of Israel." Those words, like a sacred seal, ended Ruth's shame and Naomi's silence. The door of destiny had opened, and those who stepped through were not heroic warriors, but a righteous man, a loyal foreign woman, and an aged mother who once dared not hope. Naomi said nothing. She didn't weep loudly or laugh with joy, but in eyes once etched with years of loss, a strange light now glimmered, a faith reborn, holy and quiet. Divine justice doesn't always come with thunder or miracles. Sometimes it arrives in the nods of elders, in a sandal passed in silence, in one man stepping back so another can rise. And God, whom Naomi thought silent when she lost her husband and sons, now showed her he had never left. He was waiting for the moment to reveal his hand, so all would know. He is the one who writes endings no one could foresee. Morning light slipped through a small window, casting a glow on the faint smoke rising from a simmering pot of porridge. In that tiny Bethlehem home, the cry of a newborn pierced the air. Not a wail of loss, but a triumphant song of life. Ruth had given birth to her first son, and beside the bed, Naomi cradled the child in her arms, her hands trembling, not from age, but from the miracle unfolding in her heart. This wasn't her son, yet the women of the village, witnessing the scene, whispered to one another, "A son has been born to Naomi." Not to Ruth. They knew, and Naomi knew. God had restored what she thought was lost forever. A lineage, a place in His divine plan. Proof that grace doesn't end just because bitterness once took hold. Arms that once held a husband through tears, that bid farewell to two sons returned to dust, now embraced a tiny, warm child, a living symbol of divine restoration. Naomi was no longer the woman who called herself Mara, bitter. The light in her eyes was no longer shadowed by despair, but sparkled with hope. Her name, Naomi, pleasant, had reclaimed its truth. They named the boy Obed. As a fragile infant, no one knew he would become the father of Jesse and grandfather of King David. But God knew. And the miracle was this: the entire lineage leading to the Messiah, to Jesus himself, began anew in the arms of an aging widow, through the loyalty of a foreign woman, and from a humble plan crafted in a poor Bethlehem home. If anyone was ever deemed an outcast in history, it was Naomi. But the Bible doesn't forget her. God doesn't forget her. And the same is true for you today. Perhaps you've lost someone dear. Maybe you've renamed yourself in your heart. From awe to bitterness, from trust to doubt. But if Naomi could transform from Mara back to Naomi, so can you. No one is beyond the reach of grace. No broken heart is too shattered for God to heal. No ruined story is too far gone for Him to rewrite, perhaps even more beautifully than before. Naomi didn't get her husband or sons back, but she received something greater. She became a keeper of God's promise for a nation. Her story didn't end in tragedy, but became a bridge to a glorious future. If you're walking through a spiritual winter, if your life feels like it's a crumbling, look to Naomi. Not when she was bitter, but when she held her grandson, her face radiant with light, her eyes softly closed in a peace beyond understanding. God doesn't promise a life without pain, but He promises no tear is wasted. No failure is beyond His power to renew. Naomi is proof, vivid, honest, unyielding, that God is still writing your story with mercy. So if today you feel like your story is over, don't close the book. You may be at the very turning point where God, as He did for Naomi, is preparing a second chance, a new beginning, and an ending you never dared to dream. If Naomi's story touches your heart, share it. Don't keep it to yourself. Let others know there is hope, there is faith, there is a God waiting for them at the end of their brokenness. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to join us in uncovering more untold stories where the forgotten are placed at the heart of redemption's history. For no one is forgotten, not one, not ever.